The auditorium was too quiet for a place that held over 300 people, not the respectful kind of quiet, the sharp, suffocating kind where silence itself feels like laughter waiting to happen. On the massive stage, beneath blinding white lights, stood a boy. No, a schoolboy, 14, maybe 15, thin shoulders, too big blazer borrowed from the school supply room. His dark hands trembled slightly as he gripped a marker that had already dried at the tip. Behind him, projected across a 30-foot screen, was a chalkboard replica filled with symbols most adults in the room had spent their entire careers arguing over. Integrals, paradoxes, a problem labeled in bold serif font. The HARRINGTON conjecture unsolved for 40 years. At the front row sat the men who owned that problem, professors, scholars, award winners, journal editors. And standing directly in front of the boy, close enough to feel his breath, was Professor Leonard Harrington himself. Tall, silver-haired, Nobel-nominated, smiling the way predators do when they already know the outcome. Harrington adjusted his microphone and let out a soft chuckle. "Well," he said, glancing at his watch, "the young man did say he could solve it." A ripple of laughter slid through the audience, not loud, controlled, educated, the worst kind. The boy swallowed. His name badge, barely visible from the crowd, read, Elijah Carter, Northridge Public School, a public school kid, invited here as a special curiosity after he'd made the mistake of raising his hand during a Q&A session meant for graduate students and postdocs. Elijah had spoken quietly then, almost apologetically. "I think the contradiction disappears if the boundary condition is redefined." The room had laughed. Professor Harrington hadn't. He'd smiled. And now, 10 minutes later, Elijah Carter stood alone on stage while Harrington turned slightly toward the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrington announced, voice dripping with amusement, "this is a perfect example of why we encourage questions but discourage delusions." More laughter. Someone in the back coughed to hide theirs. Elijah's ears burned. He looked out into the sea of faces, mostly white, mostly old, mostly confident, and felt something heavy press against his chest. "I shouldn't be here," his mind screamed. "I told Mom I'd just watch. I told her I wouldn't talk." Harrington turned back to him. "Go on, son," the professor said, tilting his head. "Explain to us how you've done what entire departments couldn't." Elijah lifted the marker. It squeaked against the board. The sound alone made a few people wince. He wrote a single line, then stopped. Harrington sighed theatrically. "Is the marker too heavy?" he asked. "Or perhaps the math?" The audience laughed again, this time louder. Elijah's fingers tightened until his knuckles whitened. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "If the assumption in step 3 treats infinity as static, then the paradox is unavoidable. But if—" Harrington interrupted with a raised hand. "No," he said sharply. "Let's not waste everyone's time with half-formed thoughts." He turned to the audience again. "You see, this is why raw talent without discipline is dangerous. It gives children confidence without comprehension." A woman in the second row nodded approvingly. A man whispered, "Exactly." Elijah felt the heat behind his eyes. He forced himself to keep standing, forced himself not to run. "But sir," Elijah said, barely above a whisper, "you said to follow the contradiction, not avoid it." That stopped the laughter, just for a second. Harrington turned slowly. "What did you say?" Elijah swallowed hard. "You said last year in your Cambridge lecture that the paradox should be followed until it breaks, not resolved artificially." The air shifted. A few heads turned. Harrington's smile tightened. "That lecture is not available to the public," he said coolly. "How would you know that?" Elijah hesitated. I watched the recording." "Which recording?" "The private symposium, the one uploaded for faculty review." Murmurs rippled across the room now. Harrington stepped closer. "You're lying." "No, sir. You're a child." "Yes, sir." More laughter, nervous this time. Harrington leaned in so only Elijah could hear him. "Do you know what happens to boys like you," he whispered, "when they forget their place?" Elijah's throat closed. He thought of his mother working night shifts at the hospital, of his little sister sleeping on the couch so he could have the desk, of the math books borrowed, never owned. "I'm not trying to embarrass anyone," Elijah said softly. "I just wanted to show." "Show what?" Harrington snapped, raising his voice again. "That genius comes from nowhere. That decades of peer-reviewed work can be undone by a public school student with a marker." He turned sharply to the crowd. "This is what arrogance looks like when it wears innocence as a costume." The humiliation was complete now. Phones were out. Whispers were spreading. A few people were smiling with pity. Elijah stared at the equations behind him. They blurred. His hands shook. "I should apologize," he thought. "I should say I was wrong." Harrington folded his arms. "Well," he demanded, "solve it." Seconds passed, 30, a minute. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Harrington exhaled loudly. Enough! He turned to the event coordinator. Escort him off the stage, he said. We've indulged this little experiment long enough. The coordinator hesitated. But Professor, I said, enough. Two security guards at the side of the stage began moving. The crowd leaned forward. Elijah felt his chest tighten. He opened his mouth to speak, to say I'm sorry or thank you or please, when a voice cut through the room. Clear, calm, powerful. Stop! Everyone froze. The guards halted mid-step. Professor Harrington stiffened. From the far end of the auditorium, a man stood up slowly, mid-40s, dark suit, no badge, but the people near him were already whispering. Is that? No way. Why is he here? The man walked down the aisle, eyes fixed on the stage. On Elijah. Harrington frowned. Sir, he said irritably, this is a closed academic session. The man didn't stop walking. I know, he replied. I funded it. The room went dead silent. He reached the foot of the stage and looked up at the boy, really looked at him. Elijah's breath hitched. The man smiled, not amused, not mocking, proud. Son, the man said gently, why didn't you finish? Elijah's lips trembled. I wasn't allowed. The man turned slowly toward Professor Harrington. And in that moment, before another word was spoken, something changed. Because Harrington's face went pale, not confused, not angry, afraid. And the audience had no idea why. Not yet. Question of the day, have you ever been judged unfairly or laughed at before anyone knew the truth about you? Tell us your story in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from, but before we see how this ends, let's go back to where this story truly began 3 years earlier. The alarm on Elijah Carter's phone buzzed at 4:45 a.m., long before the sun even considered rising. Elijah didn't groan, didn't complain, didn't hit snooze. He rolled quietly off the mattress on the floor, careful not to wake his little sister, Amara, who was curled up on the couch with her school uniform folded neatly beside her. Their apartment, 2 rooms above a closed-down laundromat, was always cold in the mornings, especially in winter. Elijah pulled on his hoodie and padded into the kitchen. The light flickered before staying on. On the counter sat a folded note in his mother's handwriting. Eli left early for the hospital. Dinner S in the fridge, walk Amara to school. I love you. Mom, he smiled faintly. His mother, Ruth Carter, worked double shifts as a night nurse. She used to apologize for missing dinners, missing weekends, missing everything. Elijah had stopped letting her. He reheated oatmeal, divided it into 2 bowls, and sat at the tiny table with a thick, battered notebook propped open beside him. Its pages were filled edge to edge with equations, diagrams, and questions scribbled in pencil so light they almost vanished. This wasn't school homework. This was his real work. By the time Amara shuffled out rubbing her eyes, Elijah had already solved 3 problems, none of which appeared in any textbook she'd ever see. Morning, genius, she yawned. Morning, he said, sliding her bowl toward her. You've got spelling today, she groaned. Can you help me after school? Always. At school, Elijah was invisible when teachers weren't frustrated by him, and a problem when they were. North Ridge Public didn't know what to do with a boy who finished exams in 10 minutes and then filled the margins with proofs his teachers didn't recognize. Stick to the syllabus, Mr. Granger, his math teacher, told him once, irritation obvious. You're not here to show off. I'm not, Elijah said quietly. I just see another way. That answer earned him detention. By 8th grade, Elijah had learned a painful truth. Being smart didn't make life easier, it made it lonelier. Other kids mocked him for talking white. Teachers accused him of cheating when his answers were too clean. Counselors suggested vocational tracks, something practical. No one asked how he knew what he knew. No one except Dr. Evelyn Moore. Dr. Moore taught one advanced math elective at a nearby community college. She volunteered at North Ridge once a week, running an after-school enrichment club that most students attended for the free snacks. Elijah came for the problems. One afternoon, she noticed him solving a differential equation on the whiteboard backwards. Where did you learn that method? She asked. Elijah shrugged. I didn't, I just thought it made sense. She stared at his work for a long time. You know, this approach hasn't been published, she said slowly. Oh, Elijah replied, erasing the board. Sorry. Don't you dare erase that, she snapped, then caught herself and laughed. Sorry, I didn't mean just don't. That was the beginning. Dr. Moore started bringing him books, old conference papers, scanned lectures, and one name came up again and again, Leonard Harrington, a legend in theoretical mathematics, the architect of the Harrington conjecture. A problem so elegant and so infuriating that entire careers had been built trying and failing to crack it. Elijah read everything he could find, then everything he couldn't. Forums, archived lectures, leaked symposium recordings. At night, while the city slept, Elijah sat at the desk he'd built from scrap wood and rewrote the conjecture from scratch. What if the contradiction isn't a flaw, he wondered? What if it's a signal? Months passed, then a year. Then one night at 2:13 a.m., something clicked. Elijah stared at the page. His heart started racing. The paradox didn't need to be removed, it needed to be reframed. He rewrote the assumption, shifted the boundary condition. The contradiction collapsed not into chaos, but into something cleaner, something elegant, something terrifying, because if he was right, decades of academic certainty were wrong. He didn't tell anyone at first, not Dr. Moore, not his mom, who would believe him. Then came the email. An announcement plastered across every academic board. Dr. Moore followed. The HARRINGTON Symposium, a closed-door debate on the unsolvable, top scholars invited. Media present, a public Q&A at the end. Dr. Moore stared at the screen, then at Elijah. "Promise me something," she said carefully. "What? If you speak, you do it respectfully." Elijah nodded. "I always do." The day of the symposium, Elijah wore his only blazer, the one donated by a church drive. It was a size too big, the sleeves rolled twice. His mother hugged him before he left. "Just listening today," she reminded him gently. "No pressure." "I know," he said, but when the moment came, when Professor Harrington stood on stage and declared, "The contradiction proves the boundary is immutable," Elijah's hand rose before fear could stop it. The rest was history. Now back in the present, the same boy who'd once whispered ideas into notebooks stood under unforgiving lights, his future hanging by a thread. Because today wasn't just about pride, it was about opportunity. Dr. Moore had quietly submitted Elijah's work to a youth research grant. If today went well, doors would open. Scholarships, mentorships, a way out. If today went wrong, he would be labeled what Harrington had already implied: a joke. And that was why this day, this exact day, mattered more than Elijah could afford, because he wasn't just standing for himself. He was standing for every night his mother worked late, every time his intelligence made him a target, every door that had closed because he didn't look like what genius was supposed to be. And none of the people laughing in that auditorium knew the truth yet. They didn't know what Elijah had solved. They didn't know who had been quietly watching his work for months. And they had no idea that the man who just stood up in the back of the room wasn't there by accident. The hall smelled of polished wood, old paper, and the faint trace of expensive cologne, the kind of smell that always seemed to belong to people who believed they owned the world. Elijah had never felt so small. Not in a classroom, not in detention, not even the time he presented a science project to the state board, and the judges whispered to each other as if he weren't there. He adjusted his too large blazer again, tugged at the collar of his shirt, and walked up the steps to the auditorium. Each step echoed like a drumbeat, announcing his presence to a room full of people who had already decided he didn't belong. At the entrance, the assistants had tried to reassure him. "You've got this," Dr. Moore said, gripping his shoulder briefly. "Remember what we practiced. Confidence comes from truth." Truth. That word alone carried the weight of months of work, countless sleepless nights, and hundreds of pages filled with scribbled formulas. But now, staring at the crowd of professors, students, and journalists, Elijah felt the tiniest flicker of doubt. The conference room was set like a courtroom. The panel of professors sat in a semi-circle at the front, notebooks open, pens poised. Behind them, rows of attendees whispered to one another, some curious, some skeptical, some already forming their judgment. At the center of it all was Professor Leonard Harrington, the living legend, the man whose work had haunted the world of mathematics for decades. Harrington's gaze swept the room, stopping on Elijah with a slow, deliberate intensity that made the boy's stomach churn. "You must be Elijah Carter," Harrington said, his voice calm, yet sharp enough to make the air tremble. "The young man who believes he can solve what so many others have failed to understand." Elijah nodded, clutching his notebook a little tighter. "And yet," Harrington continued, leaning back in his chair, "I have to wonder what makes a public school student think he can outperform a lifetime of scholarship." Laughter rippled through the room. Not a kind laugh, but the cruel, knowing kind. The type that sinks its teeth in and refuses to let go. Elijah's jaw tightened. He had expected this. He had practiced for it, but hearing it, feeling it directed straight at him, made it sting anyway. He started, then stopped, realizing words alone weren't enough. He needed the board, he needed his equations. The only way to make them see the truth was to show it. Harrington noticed his hesitation and smirked. "Ah, yes," he said. "The silent type, perfect. Silence suits the incapable." Elijah's hands trembled slightly, but he took a deep breath. He approached the large digital board at the center of the stage. Every eye in the room was on him. Every whisper seemed louder. Every heartbeat felt like it could betray him. He picked up the stylus and wrote the first symbol carefully, deliberately. The audience watched. Some frowned, some leaned forward, some whispered. A few raised skeptical eyebrows as if to say, "We'll see how long this lasts." "Step 1, Elijah said softly but firmly, is to redefine the boundary condition so that the infinite term is dynamic rather than static." Harrington's eyes narrowed. "Ah, yes, I remember. This is the part where you pretend to understand something you have not." A few professors chuckled behind their notebooks. Elijah ignored them. He moved to the next step, each stroke on the digital board confident now, despite the fear twisting in his stomach. The equations were flowing from him as naturally as breathing. He wasn't inventing, he was revealing what had been hidden in plain sight all along. "But this," Harrington interrupted sharply, standing now, his presence suddenly larger than the room itself. "This is not the way my calculations have shown." "I know," Elijah said, his voice gaining strength. "I've studied your work, but the contradiction only exists if you assume infinity is fixed. If you treat it as dynamic, the paradox resolves itself." The room froze, a few heads tilted, one or two professors leaned closer, the whispers stopped. Harrington's smile tightened. "Interesting, and where did you?" "From the symposium recordings," Elijah said, steady now, meeting Harrington's gaze without flinching. "The private lecture you gave last year, you told faculty to follow the contradiction until it broke." "I did." A subtle murmur ran through the audience. A hand went up in the back, a graduate student uncertain. "Are you saying he watched that?" The student whispered to the person next to them. Harrington's face hardened. His skin looked almost translucent under the harsh lights, revealing veins like fine threads. He took a step toward Elijah. You weren't supposed to know that," Harrington hissed, his calm facade cracking. "No student is ever given access to those recordings. That was private." Elijah's voice was clear, carrying across the room. "I wasn't trying to access anything I shouldn't. I only wanted to understand. And I did." The room fell silent. Even the snickering attendees were quiet now, tension replacing their amusement. "Do you understand what you're saying?" Harrington growled, pacing in front of the boy. "You are suggesting you've solved a problem that has baffled some of the greatest minds for decades. A child has done this." Elijah nodded. "I didn't set out to embarrass anyone. I only wanted to show that the boundary assumption was the key. Everything else falls into place after that." One of the professors whispered to another, "He might actually be right." Harrington spun toward the whisperers, eyes flashing. "Do you dare condone this?" Elijah felt the first pang of hope. The room was not fully on his side yet, but doubt had entered Harrington's armor. That was the first crack. But just as relief started to surface, Harrington snapped his fingers. Two security guards stepped toward Elijah. "Take him down," Harrington barked. "I've had enough of this nonsense." "This boy, this fraud, has no place here." Panic shot through Elijah's chest. The audience froze again, whispers turning into murmurs of horror. The guards reached for him. "Wait!" A voice rang out, clear, commanding. Every eye turned toward the back. A man in a dark suit was walking down the aisle, his steps measured, his eyes locked on Elijah. The chatter in the room stopped. Even Harrington hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. The man reached the stage. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. There was an authority about him, the kind that silences doubt. "Let him finish," the man said simply. The guards froze. Harrington's mouth opened, then closed. He looked like he was trying to recall some rule that would give him power over the situation, but none came to mind. Elijah's heart pounded. The audience watched, breath held. The man's gaze fell on Elijah. "You have been patient. Now show them." Elijah raised the stylus again. The crowd leaned forward. Every step he had taken, every late night, every whispered solution to a problem no one believed he could solve, led to this moment. And all along, Harrington had no idea that the man who had just intervened wasn't a stranger. He was someone with access, with influence, someone who had been quietly tracking Elijah's progress from the start. Harrington's eyes widened ever so slightly. The realization hadn't yet dawned. What he didn't know was far more dangerous than what he had just seen. Because the room was about to witness a truth that would leave Harrington powerless and change Elijah's life forever. The auditorium seemed to hold its breath. Harrington's face, once a mask of arrogance and superiority, was now a storm of confusion, disbelief, and fear. The professors whispered among themselves, some leaning closer to one another, trying to make sense of what was happening. And Elijah, his hands still on the stylus, heart pounding, felt the world shift beneath him. The man in the dark suit stepped forward, straightened his tie, and raised a hand. All conversation stopped. The weight of authority in that gesture alone silenced the murmurs, froze the whispers, and forced the room to focus entirely on him. "Professor Harrington," the man said, calm but resolute, "do you recognize this young man?" Harrington's lips parted. He frowned. You do," the man interrupted. "Yet you've been trying to humiliate him in front of everyone, pretending he's a mere child with misplaced confidence. You didn't realize, did you, that your little audience doesn't know the half of it?" Harrington's hands clenched at his sides. Sweat glimmered on his forehead. Elijah's pulse raced. He felt the strange mix of relief and disbelief. This is it, he thought. The truth will finally come out. The man turned slowly, gesturing toward Elijah. "This boy, Elijah Carter, is not just any student. He is under my guidance, and his work has been monitored, verified, and confirmed by independent researchers across the country." A ripple of surprise ran through the audience. "More importantly," the man continued, voice deepening, "he has solved a problem that has stumped the brightest minds in theoretical mathematics for over 40 years. Harrington blinked rapidly, his usual composure unraveling. He opened his mouth, then closed it, searching for a response that wouldn't betray the panic in his eyes. Elijah stepped forward, feeling steadier with each word, as if the weight of doubt was finally lifting. "Professor Harrington, the paradox only appears unsolvable because of the fixed assumption in step 3. When that assumption is adjusted," he traced the equation on the digital board, "the contradiction resolves itself elegantly." A stunned silence followed. Journalists shifted in their seats, frantically taking notes. A few professors whispered to one another, eyes wide, while some audibly gasped. Harrington's hand trembled as he reached for his glasses, pushing them up with shaking fingers. This is impossible," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The man in the suit leaned closer, voice quiet but piercing. "Impossible, perhaps, for someone who never considered the solution, but Elijah Carter has, and you have underestimated him at every turn." Harrington's face turned pale. His mouth opened again, but words failed him. His entire body seemed frozen in disbelief. He had spent decades building his authority, his reputation, and yet here was a boy, barely more than a child, who had not only understood his work but also surpassed it. Elijah felt a strange, calm settle over him. He wasn't trembling anymore. He was ready. He took a deep breath. "Professor Harrington," he said clearly, "I didn't come here to humiliate you. I came to show that the boundary condition needed redefinition. That's all. But your assumption led to the conclusion that no one could solve this, not realizing someone could see it differently." The man in the suit stepped back slightly and smiled at Elijah. "And that is why you have been invited here today, because someone with talent, persistence, and courage must be given a chance to shine." Harrington's face went ashen. You are the benefactor?" he whispered, finally understanding. The man nodded. "Yes. And I've been supporting Elijah's research quietly, ensuring he has access to resources, mentorship, and guidance. You thought this was a public humiliation, an opportunity to assert dominance, but you underestimated what you could not see, Elijah's brilliance." The audience was completely silent now. The tension was thick, almost unbearable. Every person in that room realized that they were witnessing the moment where the old order, arrogance, and prejudice collided with truth, courage, and brilliance. Harrington took a step back, as if trying to physically distance himself from the boy who had just bested him. His voice, when it came, was barely audible. I had no idea." Elijah looked at him calmly. "That's the problem with arrogance, Professor. You assume that experience alone makes one infallible. Sometimes the world proves you wrong." Harrington swallowed hard. His breathing became rapid. The authority he had wielded for decades now seemed meaningless, hollow. The man in the suit placed a firm hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Everyone here," he said, his voice loud enough to carry to the back of the auditorium, "must understand something very important. Talent and truth do not discriminate. They appear where they will, regardless of age, background, or station." A few professors' mouths hung open. Journalists' cameras clicked frantically. The audience seemed unable to move, caught between disbelief and awe. Harrington's eyes shifted between the man and Elijah. His arrogance had evaporated entirely, leaving only the realization that he had been exposed, not for an error in mathematics, but for a profound misjudgment of character. Elijah felt a surge of relief, but it was quickly tempered by empathy. "I know this is difficult to accept," he said softly, "but the math doesn't lie and neither do the results. All I want is for the truth to be acknowledged so we can move forward together." Harrington's face went pale. He looked around at the audience, now whispering, murmuring, some nodding, others shaking their heads in disbelief. For the first time in his life, the professor felt powerless. The man in the suit turned to the audience. And that is why we celebrate talent, persistence, and integrity, not titles, not pedigrees. Elijah Carter has earned this moment, and it is a reminder that brilliance often comes from the most unexpected places. Elijah's lips curved into a small, genuine smile. He had endured humiliation, fear, and doubt, and now the truth was undeniable. The crowd shifted from skepticism to awe, their whispers turning into murmurs of admiration. Harrington sank into his chair, hands gripping the armrests, pale and shaken. For the first time in decades, he had been humbled, not by age, not by experience, but by the courage and intellect of a boy he had dismissed as insignificant. Elijah glanced at the man in the suit, nodding slightly. The silent acknowledgement passed between them. The work had been recognized, the truth had been revealed, and justice, in a way, had arrived. And in that instant, Elijah understood something profound. This wasn't just about solving a decades-old problem. This was about showing the world and himself that intelligence, courage, and perseverance were worth more than appearances, arrogance, or prejudice. Harrington's voice, trembling, finally broke the silence. I underestimated you. I was wrong. Elijah nodded. It's okay, Professor. The important thing is that the solution is clear now. We can all learn from it. The room erupted, not in laughter, not in mockery, but in stunned applause. Some professors rose to their feet. Journalists scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked, capturing the moment a boy had not only solved a decades-old mystery, but also exposed the hubris of a man who had believed himself untouchable. For Elijah, it was more than recognition. It was validation of years of effort, nights spent working alone, and sacrifices made quietly for the sake of discovery. And for Professor Harrington, it was a moment he would never forget, a humbling lesson in humility, respect, and the unexpected power of youth. The applause was deafening. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was recognition, astonishment, and admiration all rolled into one. Elijah stood frozen for a moment, letting it wash over him. The humiliation he had endured earlier, the mocking smirks, the whispered fraud, the laughter was gone, replaced by something far more powerful, validation. Harrington, still pale, sank lower into his chair. His hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white. The aura of invincibility he had carried for decades had evaporated, leaving only a man confronted by the undeniable truth. The man in the dark suit, who had quietly commanded the room earlier, stepped forward again. Professor Harrington, he said, voice firm and authoritative, your treatment of Elijah Carter violated every principle we value in this institution. Public humiliation, intimidation, and discrimination have no place here. Harrington opened his mouth, stammering. I was trying to... You were trying to maintain authority, the man interrupted. But authority that relies on belittling others is not authority at all, it's tyranny. Two administrative assistants moved quickly to his side, quietly handing him a letter. Harrington glanced at it. It was a formal notice, a reprimand, immediate suspension pending review, and a requirement to attend professional ethics training before returning to any academic setting. The room's hush magnified his shock. You will address this publicly, the man continued, and apologize for your behavior. Harrington's shoulders sagged. The arrogance that had defined him for years had crumbled in minutes. The audience, witnessing his fall, felt a mix of schadenfreude and relief. Justice, long delayed, was finally served. Elijah exhaled slowly, his focus now shifting from the professor to the people who had supported him. Dr. Evelyn Moore was standing nearby, eyes glistening with tears of pride. She had been there from the beginning, quietly nurturing his talent, believing in him when no one else did. The man in the suit turned to Elijah. And you, Elijah Carter, you have demonstrated not only brilliance but courage and humility. You have the opportunity now to shape your own future. Elijah's heart swelled. This wasn't just about recognition, it was about opportunity. Scholarships, mentorships, and invitations to research programs would soon follow. His family's sacrifices, his sleepless nights, and the countless times he had been underestimated were finally validated. Dr. Moore stepped forward, embracing Elijah tightly. I always knew you had this in you, she whispered. You just had to show the world. Elijah hugged her back, feeling the relief and joy pouring through him. Thank you, Dr. Moore, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you. The man in the suit, who had quietly observed the unfolding drama, nodded. And now, it's time to ensure that others like you are given the chance they deserve. Elijah, you'll be leading a special mentorship program for young mathematicians. This is your chance to help others who are overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. Elijah's eyes widened. Really? I get to do that? Absolutely, the man said. Talent like yours shouldn't have to struggle in silence. You will help open doors for others and ensure that brilliance is recognized regardless of background. Meanwhile, the audience was still buzzing. Some professors were apologizing quietly to one another, realizing they had participated, even passively, in the humiliation of someone far more capable than they had imagined. Journalists crowded around Elijah, scribbling notes, snapping photos, and capturing the story of the day. A schoolboy solved a decades-old problem and humbled a legendary professor. Harrington, now forced to confront the consequences of his arrogance, remained seated, a mixture of shame and disbelief etched across his face. The man in the suit approached him one last time. "Professor Harrington," he said quietly, "you will be held accountable for your actions. Learn from this. Respect talent, respect truth, and never underestimate the courage of a young person who has worked harder than you can imagine." Harrington nodded weakly, words failing him. It was the first lesson in humility he had ever truly learned, and he would not forget it. As the auditorium began to empty, Elijah walked off the stage, flanked by Dr. Moore and the man in the suit. Security and organizers stepped aside, giving him space. For the first time, he felt safe, not just physically, but emotionally. He had endured ridicule, fear, and doubt, and he had emerged victorious. Backstage, Dr. Moore turned to him, her eyes bright. "Elijah, you've changed everything today, not just for yourself, but for every student who's ever been told they weren't enough." Elijah smiled, a mix of relief and pride. "I just did what I had to. I couldn't let the work go unrecognized. It wasn't just for me. It was for all the nights I spent alone, all the sacrifices Mom made, all the students who have been ignored." She squeezed his shoulder. "And now the world sees it. You've proven that brilliance and courage can overcome prejudice and arrogance." Elijah looked back toward the auditorium one last time. Professor Harrington sat alone, staring at the equations Elijah had written, his posture slumped in defeat. Elijah didn't feel anger toward him anymore, not really. He felt pity, a recognition that arrogance had blinded him to truth. Turning back to Dr. Moore and the man in the suit, Elijah took a deep breath. "What happens next?" "You," the man said, "will be a mentor, a guide, and an inspiration. Your reward isn't just recognition, it's the chance to create change, to ensure no one else is underestimated the way you were." Elijah nodded, a sense of purpose settling over him. The humiliation, the fear, the isolation, they were all behind him now. Ahead lay opportunity, mentorship, and the chance to make a lasting impact. Dr. Moore smiled. "I think it's safe to say, Elijah Carter, you're going to be unstoppable." He laughed softly. "I hope so. But more than that, I want to make sure others don't have to fight so hard to be seen." The man in the suit placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder one final time. "That's the spirit. And remember, courage, integrity, and perseverance will always be stronger than arrogance, cruelty, or prejudice." As they walked toward the exit, the crowd still buzzing behind them, Elijah felt a sense of peace he had never known. The world had finally seen what he was capable of, and it had changed everything. He glanced back one last time at Professor Harrington, who had finally stood and was quietly gathering his things. No words were exchanged, but Elijah didn't need them. The lesson had been learned, justice had been served, and redemption for him and for everyone who had doubted him was complete. Outside, the cold air hit Elijah's face, sharp and invigorating. He inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the past lift, replaced by possibility. Today wasn't just a victory in mathematics, it was a triumph over prejudice, arrogance, and fear. For Elijah, it was the beginning of everything. 1 year had passed since that fateful day in the auditorium. The streets of North Ridge looked the same. The corner deli still sold the same sandwiches. The bus routes hadn't changed. But for Elijah Carter, nothing felt the same. He walked down the familiar path to school, his backpack heavier now, not with textbooks, but with purpose. A small plaque attached to the front of the building read, "North Ridge Young Scholars Program, mentored by Elijah Carter." It was surreal. A year ago, he had been ridiculed, mocked, and nearly humiliated on stage. Now he was the mentor, the example, the person other students looked up to. Inside the classroom, students of all ages gathered eagerly. Some were shy, some skeptical, but all were curious. Elijah had learned that curiosity was the fuel of brilliance, and he planned to light that spark in every student who walked through the door. "Okay, everyone," Elijah said, his voice steady but warm, "today we're going to tackle problems that are supposed to be impossible. But remember, nothing is impossible if you approach it the right way." Hands shot up immediately. Questions flew, some tentative, some bold. Elijah smiled, feeling the same nervous excitement he had felt a year ago. only this time it wasn't for himself, it was for them. "Eli, look," a student called, holding up a complex equation they had solved. "I think I figured it out." Elijah knelt beside them, examining the work carefully. "Exactly," he said. "You followed the contradiction instead of avoiding it. That's the first step towards solving problems that seem unsolvable. Well done." Meanwhile, back in academia, Professor Harrington's fate had unfolded as publicly as his humiliation. He had been suspended indefinitely, required to attend ethics training, and had publicly apologized to Elijah. The press had covered the story extensively: how arrogance had been humbled by a young genius, how prejudice had been exposed, and how mentorship and guidance could change lives. Elijah had not relished in Harrington's downfall. Instead, he saw it as a cautionary tale, a reminder that power without humility could be destructive. The professor had learned a hard lesson, and though he remained in the field, he now approached students differently, his lectures tempered with respect and caution. Elijah, on the other hand, had been invited to speak at international symposiums, collaborate with top mathematicians, and lead initiatives designed to identify and nurture hidden talent. Scholarships and grants poured in not because he demanded recognition, but because his work spoke for itself. At home, the atmosphere was lighter than ever. His mother, Ruth, no longer had to work double shifts just to keep the lights on. She had been offered a managerial position at the hospital with better hours, giving her time to rest and support her children. Amara was thriving, excelling in school and inspired by her brother's determination and courage. One evening, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, the same table he had worked at a year ago, now cluttered with notebooks, student projects, and letters from young aspiring mathematicians. Dr. Moore stopped by, carrying 2 mugs of cocoa. "You've changed so many lives, Elijah," she said softly, "and yet you haven't changed yourself. You're still humble, still kind." He smiled, sipping his cocoa. "I think that's the most important part. The math is amazing, yes, but if you can't use your gifts to help others, what's the point?" Dr. Moore nodded, eyes glistening. "Exactly, and you've inspired a generation to see potential where others might overlook it. That's more important than any theorem." Later that week, Elijah attended a ceremony at the university where the Harrington conjecture had been officially updated to include his solution. Scholars, journalists, and dignitaries applauded, but Elijah only had eyes for the students who had come to see him speak. He remembered how it felt to be mocked, dismissed, and underestimated. He wanted them to feel seen, validated, and empowered. After the ceremony, he stood quietly in a hallway lined with plaques and framed photographs. A reporter approached, holding a microphone. "Eli, a year ago, you were humiliated in front of hundreds of people. Now you've solved one of the most complex problems in mathematics and inspired countless students. How does it feel?" Elijah paused, thinking carefully. "It feels right, not because of the recognition, but because the work mattered, because truth prevailed over arrogance, and because we finally understand that talent and perseverance exist in places we might never expect." The reporter nodded, impressed. "And what would you tell other kids who feel underestimated or ignored?" Elijah smiled gently. "Believe in yourself, work hard, seek knowledge even when others doubt you, and remember, just because someone dismisses you today doesn't mean your potential isn't real. One day the world will see what you've always known about yourself." Outside, the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over North Ridge. Elijah looked at the horizon, feeling a sense of fulfillment he had never imagined possible. He had faced ridicule, fear, and doubt, and had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to guide others toward their own greatness. 1 year later, Elijah Carter was no longer just a schoolboy with a dream. He was a mentor, a role model, and a living testament to the power of courage, perseverance, and integrity. And for Professor Harrington, the lesson had been painfully clear. Underestimating others, especially those you assume are inferior, can lead to the most public and humbling of downfalls. He had learned the hard way that brilliance knows no age, no background, and no social expectation. Elijah's journey had not only solved a decades-old mathematical problem, it had also solved the much older problem of prejudice and arrogance, reminding the world that true greatness is measured not by power or status, but by character, courage, and the willingness to stand up when it matters most. True brilliance cannot be measured by appearances, age, or pedigree. Courage, integrity, and persistence will always prevail over arrogance and prejudice. And when we choose to see potential in others, we not only change their lives, but the world itself. If Elijah's story inspired you, show your support. Like this video, share your story in the comments below, subscribe to the channel for more incredible, real-life stories of courage and triumph. Remember, sometimes the most extraordinary talent is hidden in the most ordinary places.